and in Father King and Queen's portraits are painted at Sydney during Australia's Coronation Day tribute, which includes a combined parade by the services, with Lord Wakehurst, the new Governor of New South Wales, taking the salute on behalf of King George VI.
What if the British never colonized Australia? Good day, mate. Today, Australian culture is seen as part of the Anglosphere, quite a strange fact when you consider its location relative to the traditional West. The history of Australia is strange, and it was in no way set in stone. While today we see that the British was always destined to colonize this piece of desert, it wasn't always fated to be this way. Australia for 40 to 70,000 years was inhabited by the Aborigines. These people occupied a piece of land longer than any other humans outside of Africa. Now, no offense, but the Aborigines were hunter-gatherers using Stone Age technologies up until the time of European contact, at which time a population of 750,000 is estimated as sustainable. Of course, this is due to a lack of seed-bearing plants and animals that could be domesticated. I made a whole video about why the Aborigines never developed agriculture, if you want to check that out, but it boils down to Australian geography. Add the fact that Australia is pretty isolated, and it makes sense why agriculture never spread to the continent. Around 250 nations existed by the time of permanent European colonization around 1788. While Jefferson was penning the Declaration of Independence in 1776, clans of Stone Age people are living as they had for the past 40 centuries. To put it into perspective, Australia was discovered by Europeans in 1606, when Dutch navigator Willem Janszoon made landfall on the western coast of Cape York in what is now Queensland. Willem thought that it was just an extension of New Guinea. Later Dutch explorers would map the coastlines of the continent and name it New Holland by 1644. You would think that the Dutch, being the first Europeans in Australia, would logically colonize it. But Europeans were not rabid colonizers just yet. That would happen in the 18th and 19th centuries. Many Dutch visitors saw that Australia was mostly just desert and unfit for large-scale habitation. The Dutch had the misfortune of landing in the most arid coastlines of Australia, in the west and northwest, and only had bad words to speak of the native Aborigines. Essentially, the Dutch thought that the Aborigines were too poor to dress themselves and called them black barbarians that killed some of their crew. Classic European racism. The Dutch were primarily in the trade business and did not engage in colonization on a massive scale, at least in Australia. When the Dutch Golden Age had ended, the British swooped in and claimed the chunks that were actually fertile in eastern Australia. Captain James Cook claimed all of eastern Australia in 1770 after sailing along it. The British first only annexed a portion of Australia east of the 135th meridian east longitude, called their claim New South Wales, and called the rest New Holland. A few days before the British first fleet of prisoners sailed into Port Jackson, several French ships, part of a scientific expedition, met the British before sailing off and being shipwrecked in the Solomon Islands. As the British colony grew, they tentatively left Western Australia open in case the Dutch decided to show up there. The British quickly unloaded several prisoners in 1803 on Tasmania to prevent any French claims during the Napoleonic Wars. Then, to prevent French settlement in Western Australia, the British went ahead and made several token settlements there in the 1820s, but nobody wanted to really live there. So in this alternate timeline, let's say that it's not the British that colonized Australia, but the next most likely candidate, which was consistently shut out, the French. In 1772, a French expedition led by Louis Aleno de Saint-Alone formally claimed the west coast of Australia. Yeah, there's a thing with the French and claiming vast arid deserts, apparently. But the French did not actually colonize the land, which they have a habit of doing so too, as seen with the sparse populations in New France before it fell to the British. This is because Alorn died before presenting his findings to the King of France. In this alternate timeline, the French established a town, since Alorn makes it back to France, although it would be an initially costly investment with little value in the vast desert of Western Australia. The British would see the French colony and immediately establish a colony of their own, where Cook had claimed the eastern coast, since the British seemed to have evolved as a natural adversary to the French. But hey, let's say that for the purpose of this alternate history, that the British relinquished their claims. After all, at the outset, Australia really was a useless land that was hard to colonize. The early settlers had to rely on imported foods due to the land that was not as fertile as expected. Large-scale wool harvesting from sheep made Australia economically viable. The British in 1788 were in need of a new place to stuff their prisoners and had recently lost America, leading to a gaping hole in their hearts. Also, Australia would be strategically important if war were to happen with France, Holland, and Spain, as Britain could threaten South America, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. Australia could also help protect British interests in India. In order to cure their colonialism fever, they had turned to the one land Europeans had been ignoring, Australia. In this alternate timeline, the extra prisoners are dumped into Canada instead, and Australia remains open ground for the French. In short, every British man's nightmare. In our timeline, Frenchman François Péron visited Sydney in 1802 and wrote, quote, "How could it be conceived that such a monstrous invasion was accomplished with no complaint in Europe to protest against it," end quote. And also plotted a grand plan to use rebellious Irish convicts to conquer Port Jackson under the French flag when the Napoleonic Wars resumed. This seems like a ludicrous idea since Napoleon was more than occupied with matters in Europe to send troops far away to Australia. This alternate timeline, the British abandoned any plans to seize Australia, and the French slowly, very slowly, expanded rule over Tasmania and eventually Eastern Australia, decades after the British First Fleet in our timeline. I find it very hard to believe that the British would not seize whatever small French settlement existed in Australia during the Napoleonic Wars, but it would be most likely returned afterwards, as most French colonies were restored in our timeline. The French embarked on the building of the Second French Empire starting in the mid-18th century, although Australia would be conquered probably around the time of the conquest of Algeria, lest the British encroach. The French would be much more friendly towards the Aborigines. Sure, many Aborigines would succumb to smallpox as they did in our timeline, but the French would not wantonly kill the Aborigines and instead would respect them and their culture as well. The Aborigines would be educated and westernized, not through power, but through peaceful means. The French would not occupy Australia themselves in as large numbers as the British. The French population rate was slowing down, especially in comparison to Britain and Germany in the 19th century, so few French immigrants would leave for Australia. During the Second World War, since France will be conquered by Germany, the witchy French administration will quote-unquote agree to let the Japanese take Australia at the behest of the Germans. Since the Japanese will be able to prevent the US from using Australia as a base of operations in the Pacific, the war would drag on for a bit longer, but in the end would be the same. Japan was fighting way over its head and would lose in any scenario to the Americans. After World War II, Australia would probably be granted independence from a war-weary France and become part of the wider community. This population would be much lower than it was in our timeline due to low French arrivals. It would be less of an economic powerhouse. More of the population would be composed of Asian arrivals in Australia in our timeline without restrictive immigration policies. A French Australia would not be closely affiliated with American culture and would most likely align with French islands in the region such as New Caledonia. Thanks for watching, and make sure to subscribe for more great content. This is Scholar of the World, signing out.